It was just after 11 p.m. on September 18, 1984, when Deputy Sheriff Linda Carver's voice came quietly through the radio inside the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office. She sounded calm, steady, and routine, just another late patrol in the long stretch of dark timber roads cutting through western Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. She told dispatch she was checking a Forest Service route, Highway 48 to Dry Fork Crossing, a place that saw more elk than cars at that hour. Then she said something that would later haunt the investigation. 10 to 20, checking the crossing. It was the last anyone ever heard from her. When dispatch tried calling her back a few minutes later, there was only static. A faint crackle, then silence. At first, no one panicked. Radios lost signal all the time in the mountains. But as the minutes turned into an hour, and her patrol car's beacon never reappeared on any road check, something didn't feel right. By 1 a.m., her supervisor, Sergeant Dale Henson, sent another deputy to run her route. He drove for nearly 20 miles under the canopy of pines before spotting a faint beam of light cutting across the fog, a headlight that wasn't moving. Linda's cruiser sat idling on a narrow dirt road, one tire sunk slightly into the ditch. The driver's door was open, the radio handset was hanging loose, and her flashlight lay face down in the mud, still on, its beam pointing into the woods. Her revolver was locked in its holster. The driver's seat was empty. The passenger door was closed. And her clipboard, the one she used for writing traffic reports, was lying in the passenger footwell, paper soaked through with dew. The deputy called for backup, and soon the road filled with headlights, voices, and the smell of wet pine. It was the kind of cold that bit through jackets, the kind that made your breath visible. They called her name into the trees. No answer. They fired a flare, and for a second, the woods glowed red. Then, total darkness again. By morning, every law enforcement officer in the county was involved. They fanned out through the timber with dogs, radios, and floodlights, working in grids. One team followed faint boot impressions that matched Linda's size, leading a few hundred feet down a slope toward the creek. But the trail stopped suddenly at the water's edge. No signs of a struggle. No broken branches. It was like she had simply vanished. Locals began to gather at the roadside as word spread. Some brought coffee, others flashlights, all of them whispering the same question. How could a sheriff's deputy just disappear? In Clearwater, everyone knew Linda. She'd grown up there, played basketball for the local high school, then joined the force after college, one of the first women to do so in the county. She was known for her patience, her quiet humor, and her toughness on the job. People said she was the kind of officer who treated everyone with respect, even the ones she arrested. So when her cruiser was found like that, running and abandoned, the entire town felt it, not as gossip, but as loss. That first day, the search crews brought in K-9 units from Missoula. The dogs followed her scent to the same creek, but kept circling the same area, confused. The state helicopter flew low over the ridge, scanning with infrared. Nothing. Divers entered the water, combing through the current and the slick stones, but all they found were branches and silt. It didn't make sense. There were no drag marks, no footprints leading away. The ground was soft enough to record even a deer track, but there was nothing. No signs of her boots, no signs of anyone else. By late afternoon, the sheriff's office set up a command post by the forest road. Radios hissed with constant chatter, coordinates being called, volunteers being assigned sectors. Some of Linda's coworkers refused to leave when their shifts ended. They just kept searching, driven by something deeper than duty, something like disbelief. As night fell again, fog rolled down from the hills. The forest seemed to swallow light. Flashlights barely cut through more than a few yards ahead. Deputies said later it was the kind of dark where you couldn't tell if you were walking in circles. They called her name again and again into the trees. Still nothing. Back in town, Linda's husband, Deputy Mark Carver, sat at his kitchen table surrounded by officers. His hands shook as he told them when he last saw her, around 7:30 that evening, before she left for patrol. He said she seemed tired, maybe a little on edge, but nothing unusual. He kept asking if they'd found her car yet. When they told him how they'd found it, engine running, door open, he went quiet. The sheriff stood in the corner, staring at the map pinned to the wall, the cigarette burning down in his hand. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no reason for her to leave. But there also wasn't any clue she'd been taken. For all their experience, no one in that room could explain it. As the days went on, the search widened. They brought in the National Guard, tracked the creeks downstream, combed through abandoned mining shafts nearby. Helicopters mapped the valley again, looking for tire tracks, broken branches, any disturbance in the canopy. The only new discovery came 3 days later, her deputy's badge, found half buried in the mud near the creek crossing. No fingerprints. No blood. Just mud and metal. It was as if the mountain itself was erasing her. Reporters started showing up by the end of the week. The story of the missing deputy made state news, then national. Questions grew sharper. Was she ambushed? Did she stumble into something she shouldn't have? Had she walked into those woods willingly? The sheriff's office issued statements, promising they were following all leads. But behind closed doors, morale was falling apart. Inside the small-town diner, people began sharing theories. Some said she might have chased someone into the forest and gotten lost. Others whispered about a drifter who'd been seen near the gas station days before she vanished. A few even wondered if she'd just driven away, too tired or too broken by the job to keep going. But those who knew Linda said that wasn't her. She would never leave her post, not without a reason. By the end of the first week, the search had turned up nothing new. The creek had risen slightly after rainfall, clouding the water. The cold was settling in early that year, and rescuers were running out of daylight hours. On the 9th day, the sheriff made the difficult announcement the official search would be scaled back. Volunteers refused to stop. They kept coming out for weeks, walking the same forest roads over and over, searching the same creek banks where the dogs had once barked. Eventually, even those voices faded. Winter came fast in the Bitterroots that year, snow covering every trail, every tire mark, every sign that she'd ever been there. The case file stayed open, but her name slowly drifted into that silent category no one ever wants to reach. Missing, presumed dead. Still, for those who worked that case, it never sat right. A cruiser left running, a flashlight pointed into the dark, and a deputy who never came back. Even after the snow melted, people who lived near the Dry Fork crossing said they sometimes heard things late at night. Faint voices, a radio crackle coming from the trees, like someone still calling out for backup in the dark. And though no one said it out loud, they all wondered the same thing. Whatever happened to Deputy Linda Carver didn't start with that missing patrol car. It started before that night. Somewhere along that road, something or someone had been waiting for her. Within 24 hours, the disappearance of Deputy Sheriff Linda Carver had transformed from a local worry into a full-scale emergency. The sheriff's office called in every resource they had: volunteer search teams, neighboring counties, even the National Guard. Helicopters traced the ridgelines from dawn to dusk, sweeping the valleys in tight grids, their rotors echoing against the cliffs. On the ground, teams worked the forest floor with sticks and ropes, shouting her name until their voices went raw. The dogs, trained to follow human scent through water and mud, picked up faint traces near a stream bed 2 miles from where her cruiser had been found. But the scent vanished as suddenly as it began. It was like something had cut it clean. For days, that small stretch of forest became the center of the world. Cars lined the gravel road. Radios crackled with coordinates. Deputies trudged through knee-deep mud under freezing rain, their boots filling with water as they pushed deeper into terrain that didn't want to give anything back. Searchers found tire ruts that could have been from Linda's patrol car, or could have been from any logging truck that passed through that week. They found a crushed cigarette pack, a torn piece of flannel, boot prints that led nowhere. But no signs of a struggle, no footprints that matched hers, and no reason for her to walk off the road that night. Detectives began to dig into her final hours, tracing every action she took before vanishing. Dispatch logs showed she made a routine traffic stop at around 9:40 p.m., a silver sedan with expired tags. The driver, a middle-aged man passing through from Idaho, was questioned again, but his alibi checked out. He remembered her as calm, polite, professional. She'd given him a warning and driven off into the dark. 2 hours later, she was gone. Then came the rumor about a blue pickup truck. Several locals claimed they'd seen it idling near the Forest Service Road that night, lights off, engine running. One witness said he recognized it as belonging to a man who lived alone in the timber, a recluse with a reputation for being armed and unpredictable. Deputies tracked the man down 3 days later. His name was Roy Dillman. They found him sitting on his porch, rifle across his lap, staring down the search team as they approached. His truck matched the description. But the vehicle was clean, no blood, no prints, no signs of anyone else inside. Dillman said he'd been hunting coyotes that night, which, in those parts, wasn't unusual. Still, the encounter left everyone uneasy. As the days turned into weeks, the search lost its rhythm. The terrain was relentless: steep draws, slick boulders, rivers that rose and fell without warning. Each day's progress was erased overnight by rain or wind. Maps filled with red excess where teams had already searched, but those same areas would have to be searched again once conditions changed. Helicopters couldn't fly low enough in the fog, and by the second week, several volunteers had been treated for hypothermia. Even the dogs began to falter, whining and refusing to enter certain patches of thick brush near the creek. Inside the sheriff's department, exhaustion began turning into tension. There were too many theories, and none of them made sense. Some officers believed Linda had been abducted, dragged into the woods by someone who knew how to vanish. Others began whispering the unthinkable, that she'd staged her own disappearance. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe she cracked under the stress of the job. It was easier for some to believe she left on her own than to accept the idea that one of their own could be taken, right under their noses. But the whispers grew louder when investigators started going through her home life. Her husband, Deputy Mark Carver, had been one of the first to raise the alarm that night. At first, he was treated as a grieving spouse, but inconsistencies in his statements began to surface. Small things, but enough to make people uneasy. He told one officer that Linda left home happy, humming to herself before her shift. But in another interview, he admitted they'd argued earlier that evening. Neighbors later confirmed hearing raised voices. When pressed about what the fight was over, Mark said he couldn't remember. Investigators found that strange. A few deputies did too. And though no one wanted to say it out loud, suspicion started to creep in. There were late-night calls to the station that stopped when dispatch picked up. There were rumors, unverified but hard to ignore, that Linda had been talking to Internal Affairs months before she vanished, possibly about department misconduct. If that was true, it could change everything. But when detectives searched her locker, they found nothing. No reports, no notes, no indication she was planning anything at all. As October turned to November, the temperature dropped, and the once vast search began to shrink. Volunteers returned to their jobs. The county could no longer justify the cost of keeping helicopters in the air. What had once been a scene of chaos, flashing lights, radio calls, teams moving in every direction, became quiet. Only a handful of deputies kept searching, walking the forest alone with flashlights, each hoping to find something, anything, before winter closed in. Rain turned to sleet, coating the mountains in a slick layer of ice. The creeks froze at the edges. The same spots were checked again, then marked off once more. The ground had shifted, and even the footprints from the first week were gone. One deputy later said it felt like chasing a ghost, every clue dissolving before they could touch it. By December, the sheriff made the official call to scale back operations. The search was no longer active. From that point on, it would be periodic, meaning only when new information surfaced. But no new information ever did. The last record in the daily log for the case simply read, "Area checked." Negative findings. The town changed after that. In Clearwater, there had always been a sense of safety. Neighbors left doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes until dark. But after Linda vanished, that feeling eroded. People looked over their shoulders more. Forest roads that were once weekend getaways became places no one wanted to drive after sunset. Even hunters started avoiding the Bitterroot back roads. Some said the forest felt heavier now, quieter, like it was holding its breath. At the sheriff's office, Linda's desk stayed empty. Her badge was pinned to the wall, beside the American flag. Once a week, Mark stopped by to sit in her chair for a few minutes. Coworkers said he barely spoke anymore. He'd go home early, lock himself inside their house, and refuse to answer the phone. When asked if he believed she was still alive, his answer changed depending on who asked. Some days he said yes. Other days he said nothing at all. By January, winter hit full force. Snow blanketed the hills and sealed off the upper forest roads. The case had become a cold file, one of those stories that small towns carry quietly for decades. Searchers stopped walking those roads, but locals still drove by her last known location every now and then, leaving small crosses made of twigs on the shoulder. A quiet memorial to a deputy who'd vanished without a trace. And yet, even in that silence, no one really believed she was gone. The town didn't hold a funeral. No one ever declared her dead, because there were still too many unanswered questions, too many strange details that didn't fit. Why had her flashlight been left in the mud, still burning? Why had her badge been found so far from her car days later? And why, if she truly walked away, did every trail that should have led to her just end? As winter set in, the snow buried those questions beneath a white stillness. The forest went silent. But some of the deputies who'd searched for her, men who'd known her for years, said they could never shake the feeling that the mountains were hiding something. And as the snow melted in spring and the rivers swelled with thaw, a quiet fear began to spread through Clearwater County that maybe Linda Carver hadn't disappeared by choice at all. That maybe somewhere in those woods, the truth about what happened to her was still waiting to be found. By the time the 90s rolled around, the story of the missing patrol officer had faded into something almost mythical, a half-remembered headline, a cautionary tale whispered by locals who still drove those same back roads at night. The station where Linda once signed in for duty had a new coat of paint, new faces behind the desks. But tucked away in a basement filing cabinet was a thin, weathered folder with her name stamped across the front. The paper inside smelled of dust and mildew. Case closed. No body. No answers. Her parents didn't live to see anything more. They both passed within a few years of each other, their small house left just as it had been the night she went missing, her childhood bedroom untouched, her photos still on the mantel. Neighbors said her mother never stopped leaving the porch light on, even during storms. Some nights, when the wind rattled the shutters, she'd sit by the window, whispering, "She's out there somewhere." Then, in the late 1990s, that old file surfaced again. A detective named Brewer, new to the department, still idealistic, was working through unsolved disappearances when an odd tip came in. An inmate serving time for burglary claimed he knew where the cop in the woods ended up. The phrase stuck with Brewer. The inmate spun a story about a cabin, about a night gone wrong, about something buried near a creek. It was vague, inconsistent, the kind of tale built more from rumor than memory. But it was enough to breathe life back into a case everyone had forgotten. Detectives reopened the file. They drove out to the remote area the inmate had mentioned, combing through overgrown brush and collapsed logging trails. Nothing matched. No cabin. No signs of a struggle. Just miles of damp forest and silence. It seemed like another dead end. But as Brewer sifted through the old reports back at the precinct, one overlooked line caught his attention. Linda's final radio transmission. Code 10 to 20, checking the crossing. It was routine language, but the wording was strange. Checking the crossing. Which crossing? Most of her patrol routes had been logged, yet this one wasn't. After cross-referencing the old maps, Brewer found that the only crossing on her route that night was a narrow bridge deep in the backwoods, Dry Fork Bridge. Locals knew it well. Or at least, they knew to stay away from it after dark. Over the years, that place had earned a reputation. Hunters talked about lights flickering through the trees when no cars were around. Teenagers swore they'd heard voices echoing from beneath the bridge, like someone calling for help. Some even said they'd seen a faint figure standing at the rail, staring down into the black water below, then vanishing when headlights approached. Brewer didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the locals were responding to something real, not supernatural, but human. Maybe those lights were reflections from something metal. Maybe those voices were the rush of water over debris. Still, when he and his team hiked out to Dry Fork, the air felt heavier than it should have. They brought sonar gear, the kind used to scan beneath murky rivers for submerged cars or bodies. The water under Dry Fork Bridge ran slow, thick and brown, a place where branches collected and old logs tangled together into natural dams. The sonar showed shapes, but none that made sense. Just silt, debris, and shadows. They dredged a few sections, pulling up rusted barrels, torn fishing nets, a bicycle frame. Nothing that explained Linda's disappearance. And yet, Brewer couldn't let it go. He stood on that bridge long after the others packed up, watching the water slide past in the fading light. He imagined her patrol car parked just beyond the tree line, radio crackling with static, her flashlight cutting through mist. Maybe she stopped to check something. A stranded vehicle, a noise. Maybe someone was waiting. The next week, he pulled historical weather data from the month she vanished. There had been heavy storms, flash flooding that washed out several low-lying roads and carried tons of debris downstream. If a car had gone off the bank during that time, it could have been buried beneath years of silt and fallen timber. impossible to spot without tearing the river apart. It was a haunting possibility, one that gave the first real direction to the case in nearly 2 decades. The team documented the theory that Linda's disappearance might have involved water. A car pushed, a struggle gone wrong, or simply an accident masked by nature's violence. They couldn't prove it, but it made sense. Still, something about that spot refused to rest easy. The woods around Dry Fork felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that listens back. Officers who helped with the search later said that even in broad daylight, they felt watched, as if the trees themselves remembered. And every so often, locals still swore they saw strange ripples beneath the bridge or heard the faint hum of a police radio rising from the creek after dark. Whether it was superstition or something buried deep in that muddy water, no one knew. But for the first time in years, the mystery of the missing officer wasn't just a story whispered over campfires. It was alive again, waiting, it seemed, for someone willing to look a little deeper into the ghosts of the creek. In the spring of 2002, the Clearwater River was alive in a way locals hadn't seen in years. A long, harsh winter had finally broken, and the record snowmelt from the high ridges came roaring down through the valleys, tearing loose trees and flooding pastures. Whole trunks rolled along the current like matchsticks, slamming against the banks, reshaping the river in a matter of days. It was the kind of force that reminded people how small they really were compared to the land they lived on. That April, a group of kayakers set out from the North Bend, locals who knew the water well, but even they said it felt different that morning. The air was cold and sharp, the current faster than usual. They just passed a narrow choke point when they noticed something strange lodged in a tangle of logs ahead, something that caught the sunlight and flashed. One of them thought it was a beer can. Another said it looked like the edge of a bumper. But when they paddled closer, the shape didn't fit either. It was metal, yes, but not smooth. It looked old, weathered, and out of place. They didn't linger long. The current was too strong, and they made note of the spot, a sharp bend 3 miles below Dry Fork Bridge, before moving on. That night, one of them called the county sheriff's office. He told them there was something odd in the debris pile, something that might be worth checking out. Most calls like that went nowhere, but when the deputy on duty heard the location, he froze. Dry Fork. Within hours, 2 patrol trucks were down at the riverbank, tires sinking into the wet earth. The logjam was enormous, an entire section of forest jammed together into one tangled, heaving mass. Deputies climbed over it carefully, scanning with flashlights, even though it was still daylight. Then one of them stopped. He brushed away a layer of moss and bark, and there it was, a small square piece of metal, half buried and rusted brown, still bearing the faint outline of engraved letters. Deputy L. Carver. The silence that followed was heavy. That name hadn't been spoken at a scene in more than 20 years. A few feet away, caught in a web of vine roots, were corroded handcuffs. They'd fused with the wood around them, like the forest itself had been trying to swallow them whole. The deputies radioed it in, their voices tight and uncertain. Within hours, the area was taped off. Search and rescue teams arrived, followed by a dive unit from the state. When the divers went into the water, visibility was near zero. The bottom was nothing but shifting silt, debris, and cold. They worked by feel, sweeping slowly along the submerged tangle beneath the jam. After several hours, one of them surfaced and motioned to the lead investigator. They found something solid, metal, not driftwood. Piece by piece, divers cleared the muck and pulled away branches until the outline of a car frame began to take shape. It was twisted, corroded, and buried under layers of riverbed. Most of it was unrecognizable, just rust and rot. But certain things survived time better than others. In what remained of the front section, still bolted to a warped beam, they found scraps of a uniform belt, the kind issued to county deputies in the 1970s. And near it, caught beneath a folded piece of metal, were what appeared to be small bone fragments. The sight went quiet. The divers came up one by one, heads bowed, as word spread through the group. After all these years, it seemed the river had finally given her back. Forensic teams were brought in to catalog everything before the car was lifted from the water. The serial number on the radio matched the one issued to Deputy Linda Carver in 1979. DNA from the bone fragments confirmed what no one wanted to say out loud. After 23 years of rumors, sightings, and ghost stories, the truth was simple and brutal. She had never left the woods. The river had held her the whole time. The news spread fast through the county. People who'd grown up hearing about the missing deputy stopped what they were doing to watch the evening broadcast. In old photos, Linda's smile looked frozen in time, bright, young, confident. Now her name filled headlines again. Only this time it came with closure that didn't feel like relief. The sheriff's office called it a recovery, not a resolution. Because even as they stood on that muddy riverbank, staring at the twisted remains of her patrol car, one question hung over everything. How did it get there? The drop from the road above was steep, but not impossible. Still, when investigators surveyed the area, there was no sign of broken railing, no tire tracks, no scars in the soil where a vehicle might have gone off. It was as if her car had simply appeared there, carried by a current that shouldn't have had the power to move it. The working theory was that the vehicle had entered the water upstream, maybe during the storm weeks after she vanished, and been dragged along by floodwaters until it wedged beneath the logjam, buried under years of sediment. It made sense on paper. But for the ones who stood there looking down at the water, it didn't feel like the whole story. Some of the older deputies remembered searching those same banks in 1979. They'd walked within a few yards of this exact bend, when the logs hadn't yet formed the jam. The car should have been visible. It wasn't. That detail bothered everyone. Even after the forensic teams packed up and the river returned to silence, the unease lingered. The discovery had given them answers, but also questions that dug deeper. If her car didn't go off the road near Dry Fork Bridge, then where had it gone in? And if it had been moved by floodwaters, why had it taken more than 2 decades for the river to finally let it go? For now, the sheriff's report simply read, "Recovered from Clearwater River, Deputy L. Carver confirmed deceased." But for those who'd carried her name for years, it didn't feel final. The river had hidden her. It had kept her secrets. And somewhere between the currents and the mud, it still held the truth of what really happened on that cold night in 1979. When the remains of Deputy Linda Carver's patrol car were lifted from the water, the entire county seemed to stop and watch. The old tow crane strained against the weight of it, the cables creaking as the river clung stubbornly to its secret. For a moment, it felt like the machine might give way, but then with a violent crack, the twisted frame broke the surface, streaming mud, river weeds, and 23 years of silence. The onlookers said the sound of metal scraping against the rocks was like something waking up after a long sleep. As the car came into view, everyone noticed how strangely preserved it was. The rear section was gone entirely, but parts of the door panel still clung to the frame. The faint ghost of white paint, once the sheriff's emblem, was visible beneath a crust of rust and moss. Inside, there wasn't much left. No weapon, no badge, no notebook, no body in the traditional sense, just fragments, bits of fabric, and the outline of a life erased by water and time. Deputies who'd served with her stood back in silence. Some of them had been young rookies back then. Now they were gray-haired, their hands trembling slightly as they watched. For them, this wasn't just the end of a mystery. It was a return of something they'd all quietly carried for decades, the guilt they could never shake. Once the recovery was complete, investigators sealed the debris in evidence containers and sent it to the state crime lab. They hoped for something, any small clue that could explain how her car ended up buried beneath a logjam no one knew existed. The initial forensic results came back within weeks. The skeletal remains were consistent with Linda's age and build. Her belt fragments matched her issued equipment. But beyond that, there was nothing. No signs of foul play, no bullet holes, no evidence that anyone else had been inside the car. That didn't make sense. The old rumors, the witness statements, the strange radio silence, they all suggested something more deliberate. One detective, a younger one who hadn't even been born when Linda vanished, spent hours combing through the original 1984 reports. He noticed a pattern everyone else had missed or ignored. The last recorded location ping on her patrol car had come not from the Dry Fork Bridge area, but nearly 6 miles east, closer to a series of abandoned logging cuts. That meant if the car had entered the river near there, it would have had to travel a near impossible distance downstream, across sharp bends and rapids. He brought it up at a briefing, and the room went quiet. No one wanted to say it out loud, but it raised a chilling possibility that maybe the car hadn't entered the water naturally at all. Maybe it had been placed there. They searched the surrounding woods again, following the old access trails that had been overgrown for decades. In one hollow, where the ground dipped sharply toward the river, they found what looked like disturbed earth, an uneven patch half covered by roots. They dug a little and found a piece of broken glass, thick and tinted, like the kind used in older police cruisers. It wasn't much, but it hinted at something, like maybe her car had gone in there first, carried downstream until it wedged into the logjam. But if that was true, why hadn't they seen any sign of it before? Why had every previous search, dogs, divers, helicopters, come up empty? As the investigation reopened, stories started surfacing again from locals who'd lived near the area back then. One man, now in his 70s, told deputies that on the night Linda went missing, he'd heard what he thought was a vehicle engine revving hard somewhere near the river, followed by a sharp metallic crash. But when he'd gone outside with a flashlight, the fog was so thick he couldn't see past his fence. He said he mentioned it to a deputy at the time, but nobody ever followed up. Another resident swore he'd seen lights moving along the logging road that same night, too late for patrols, and heading toward the direction where the car was eventually found. Those details, long buried under years of memory, gave the case new texture. Still, no one could make them fit neatly. The river was both the answer and the obstacle. It had preserved evidence but also destroyed the story behind it. Every clue they found seemed half dissolved, eaten away by water and time. By midsummer, forensic hydrologists were brought in to study the current flow patterns from historical flood data. They concluded that in the massive storm of late October 1984, just weeks after Linda vanished, the river rose nearly 8 feet, enough to dislodge small trees and debris. If her car had already been in the water by then, it could have easily been swept downstream, twisting and tumbling until it lodged under the massive tangle of wood that would become the Clearwater Logjam. That theory gave comfort to some, but not to all. Linda's husband, who had long since left the sheriff's department and moved 2 counties away, returned for the first time in over 20 years to attend the small memorial service held by the river. He stood apart from the others, arms crossed, his face unreadable. People whispered, like they always had, that he'd known more than he ever said. The inconsistencies in his old statements still lingered in the files, and though nothing tied him directly to what happened, the shadow never lifted. In his only public comment, he said quietly, "At least she's home now." But even that didn't sound certain. The story of the discovery spread beyond Clearwater County. Regional news called it the river that remembered, painting it as a tragic, almost haunting tale of nature finally giving up what it took. For the detectives, though, there was no poetry in it, only frustration. The physical evidence told one part of the story, but the motive, the human part, remained blank. There were theories. Some believed Linda had pulled over near the bridge and stepped out to check something. Maybe a stranded driver, maybe a car she thought she saw in the fog, and something went wrong. Others thought she'd been ambushed by someone she'd stopped earlier that night, and that the suspect had driven her car into the river to hide the crime. But without definitive proof, they were only stories built on silence. In late autumn, when the river settled back into its slow, cold rhythm, the sheriff's office packed up the last of the evidence boxes and filed them away. The old-timers said the sound of the water had changed since the recovery, like the river had finally exhaled. Yet, even then, something about the discovery didn't sit right. A state diver, one of the first to touch the car's frame, later admitted he'd seen something odd beneath the silt, a separate groove carved into the riverbed, almost like another object had been dragged or lodged nearby. He tried to follow it, but the visibility was too poor. They marked the location, but by the time they returned weeks later, a new flood had wiped it clean. He said he still thinks about that, how close they might have been to finding something more. Maybe another piece of the car. Maybe something or someone else. By the time winter came, the story of Deputy Linda Carver had been told and retold so many times that it almost felt like legend again. But for the men and women who'd searched those woods, for her family, for the detectives who stood by that riverbank watching the rusted frame emerge from the water, it wasn't legend. It was real, and it was unfinished. Because even after the bones, the radio, and the car, one question remained louder than all the rest. If Linda's car was there the whole time, buried in the current, hidden beneath that mass of timber, then who was the person several witnesses swore they saw driving a white patrol cruiser along the main highway, hours after her radio went dead? That single detail, tucked away in an old report from the night she vanished, refused to fade. And it would become the spark that pushed one detective years later to look deeper into what really happened that night the deputy disappeared. The discovery of Linda Carver's car didn't close the case. It blew it wide open. What had once been treated as a tragic accident was now the center of a forensic reconstruction, one that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew. The rusted frame, the riverbank, even the slope above the bend, all of it was mapped, measured, and modeled by a team of forensic engineers. What they found changed the story. The car hadn't slid. It hadn't lost traction or been swept off during the storm. It had been pushed. The data came from old topographical surveys and early satellite images taken in the years after the flood. When overlaid with a new 3D terrain model, the pattern was unmistakable. Tire impressions, two distinct sets, had cut across the soft service road above the river bend the night Linda vanished. One set matched the width and spacing of her patrol cruiser. The other came from a different vehicle, heavier, likely a truck. Both had stopped near the same point before one, Linda's, angled sharply toward the edge. The drop from there wasn't natural terrain. It was a man-made path cleared years earlier for logging access. In 1984, that road had already been unstable, weakened by runoff from early snowmelt. Whoever sent her car over the edge had chosen that spot carefully. When that detail surfaced, the sheriff's office ordered a full re-examination of every record tied to Linda's last day on duty. They went back to radio logs, dispatch sheets, and field reports. Most of it was routine, speeding tickets, noise complaints, a welfare check, but near the end of her shift, a note appeared in her log. Meeting, informant, Dry Fork area, possible meth operation. It was the first time anyone had seen that entry. The copy stored in the original file had been smudged, unreadable, but the carbon duplicate in the archives was intact. That one line changed the entire tone of the case. In the early 80s, Montana's rural counties were struggling with a growing meth problem. Remote Forest Service roads made perfect hiding spots for makeshift labs. Deputies knew about it, but operations were dangerous, often tied to loggers, truckers, and locals who knew the land better than law enforcement did. If Linda had been meeting an informant about something like that, it meant she was onto something big, something worth silencing. Investigators worked backward, looking for anyone who'd fit the description of that informant, someone named Rick. The name wasn't much to go on, but one report from October 1984 mentioned a man arrested on minor possession charges who'd offered information on forest activity in exchange for leniency. His name was Richard Harmon. According to jail records, he was released on October 9th. The same day, Linda disappeared. A week later, Harmon vanished too. His truck was found abandoned along the border of Clearwater and Missoula counties, doors open, keys still inside. At the time, no one connected it to Linda's case. Now, it seemed impossible not to. When detectives reached out to retired officers from the old task force, their responses were uneasy. Some claimed they didn't remember Harmon at all. Others hinted that the drug operations back then were more widespread than anyone wanted to admit. One retired sergeant even said Linda had been warned not to work that case alone, but she'd insisted. She didn't trust certain people on the force. Then came the most chilling revelation, something from a retired detective who'd been close to Linda. He'd kept a private notebook from that year, a habit he never turned over to the department. In the margins, dated just a few days before she disappeared, he'd written a line he never forgot. "LC worried someone leaking routes, says one of ours tipping log crews." That note, small as it was, cracked the story open even wider. If true, it meant Linda believed someone inside her own department was working with the people she was investigating. Maybe they were warning suspects about patrol movements or feeding information to protect a local operation. If she'd found proof or even confronted someone, she could have become a liability overnight. As these pieces came together, a team of cold case detectives began conducting quiet interviews with surviving deputies from that era. One name kept resurfacing, a man named Jack Ellery. He'd been a field training officer in '84, one of the last to speak with Linda on the radio. After her disappearance, Ellery left the department abruptly, moved to Idaho, and never returned. For years, no one questioned it. But when investigators found him living in a small trailer outside Coeur d'Alene, he was a shadow of who he'd been, frail, paranoid, and drowning in guilt. They didn't even have to push hard. Within minutes, he broke down. He admitted that the night Linda disappeared, she had radioed in saying she was meeting her contact near Dry Fork, but she'd also mentioned something off, that she thought she was being followed. Ellery said he didn't believe her at first. Then, hours later, when dispatch lost contact, he and another deputy went looking, but by the time they reached the area, the road was already washed out from rain. They found tire tracks leading toward the overlook, but no car, no body, nothing. When pressed about the second vehicle, Ellery hesitated. He said there had been someone else there that night, someone from the department who wasn't supposed to be. He wouldn't give a name, only saying he was in deep with them. with a cruise. Then his voice broke. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Investigators asked what it meant. Ellery wiped his face and said they were only supposed to scare her, to make her back off. He claimed Linda had caught a deputy passing information to local loggers who were moving meth through forest roads. The plan, he said, was to confront her, make her think it was too dangerous to keep digging. But when she got spooked and tried to drive off, something went wrong. Her car slipped on the soft ground, broke through the edge, and went over. He swore it was an accident. But the forensic reconstruction didn't support that story. The impact patterns on the frame showed the car's acceleration at the time of descent was too controlled to be an accident. The tires had spun deliberately, not from panic or loss of traction. It looked like someone had pushed or driven the car forward. When Ellery was confronted with that evidence, he went quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I didn't see it happen. I just know she didn't go alone." Then he muttered something investigators never forgot. "We all thought the river would take care of it." The statement was vague, legally useless, but emotionally devastating. It meant there were others who knew, maybe even helped, and they'd all relied on time and water to bury the truth. By the time the interview ended, Ellery was shaking uncontrollably. He refused to name the second officer, only saying that he had a friend higher up and that it was already handled. Days later, before investigators could bring him in again, Ellery suffered a fatal stroke. With him went the last living thread connecting the old department to the night Linda vanished. Yet even with his death, something shifted in Clearwater County. The truth had finally taken shape, not complete, but enough to see the outline. Linda hadn't been lost in a storm. She hadn't run away. She'd been silenced, caught between duty and corruption in a small town that wasn't ready to face either. But the real haunting question wasn't how she died. It was who had helped make it disappear. And as one investigator put it quietly in his final report, the river didn't just bury evidence. It buried guilt. That line would echo for months through the sheriff's office halls, because even as the case neared its end, one final discovery was still waiting downstream, something the river hadn't yet revealed. The sheriff's office, now facing mounting pressure from the media and Linda's surviving relatives, brings in outside investigators from the State Bureau. They reopen the site at Clearwater Bend, mapping every inch of the riverbank, every ridge of the washed-out service trail above it. The reconstruction is painstaking. They study old hydrological data, compare 1984 flood levels with the vehicle's resting point, and cross-reference it with patrol routes from that night. Slowly, the pattern begins to take shape. The car hadn't simply drifted there. It had been deliberately guided off the trail, pushed hard enough to clear the first slope before gravity and mud swallowed it whole. It wasn't a panic move or a mistake. Whoever did it wanted that car gone fast, and they knew that after the flood, no one would ever find it. When the engineers present their findings, the room falls silent. The angle of descent, the embedded debris, the depth of the silt, all of it points to human intent. One analyst puts it bluntly, this wasn't nature. It was a cover-up. The phrase sticks. In town, whispers start again, like old ghosts waking up. People who'd been quiet for 20 years start talking in private. The local diner sees old deputies meet in hushed corners, nervous, uneasy. Everyone remembers Linda Carver, how she was tough but kind, the one who stopped by the feed store just to check on the owners after a break-in, the one who never raised her voice unless she had to. And now, suddenly, her story has turned from tragedy to betrayal. Investigators dig into the old patrol logs and find something odd. On the night Linda disappeared, there was supposed to be a routine meeting with an informant, someone tied to a meth lab hidden near the forest's southern boundary. The man's code name was Rick. His full name never made it into the file, but follow-up notes show Linda had arranged the meeting herself off-book. She hadn't told dispatch. That detail alone is enough to send a chill through the task force. She'd only do that if she didn't trust someone in her own ranks. Then another discovery. A week after Linda vanished, Rick disappeared too. His trailer was left abandoned outside town, door hanging open, dishes still in the sink. It was written off back then as a transient case, a drug user skipping bail or fleeing dealers. But now, in light of what's been found, it reads differently. Investigators track down Rick's sister, who still lives 2 counties over. Her voice trembles as she recalls the last time she saw him. He was scared, she says. Said he'd told a cop something he shouldn't have. Said he was being watched. The deeper they dig, the darker the pattern becomes. Linda's old partner, now retired, admits she'd been nervous in the weeks before she vanished. She'd confided that someone in the department might be leaking patrol routes, possibly tipping off smugglers about roadblocks and searches. It had started as a rumor, but after her disappearance, the whispers stopped cold. That silence, in retrospect, feels almost coordinated. One retired detective, grizzled and gray, sits down with the state investigators one afternoon. He doesn't want to be recorded, but his story is damning. He claims that after Linda went missing, there was an unspoken order from above. Let it rest. He says evidence went missing, and reports were rewritten. When asked why, he lowers his eyes and mutters, because too many people stood to lose too much. Then he adds something that changes everything. She found something that night. Not a meth lab, not exactly. She found the wrong people moving the wrong stuff through the woods. That phrase, the wrong people, hangs heavy. Investigators realize they're not just chasing a cold case anymore. They're brushing against an old, rotting nerve in the county's history. The logs from that era show several deputies with financial connections to local lumber contracts. Some of those operations were later tied to illegal trafficking routes through logging roads, perfect cover for smuggling meth and stolen goods. Linda, it seems, had stumbled right into it. When they tracked down one of those retired officers, an aging man now living alone near the state line, he initially denies everything. But as questions press harder, his composure starts to crumble. He finally admits he'd been called out to Dry Fork the night Linda vanished. He says it wasn't supposed to go that way. That there'd been a confrontation on the service road, a struggle, a fall. It was an accident, he insists, tears forming in his eyes. Nobody meant for her to die. But when investigators compare his story to the forensic evidence, it doesn't hold up. The car's impact marks don't match a fall from the trail. The doors had been forced open before it entered the water. And there's a dent along the rear bumper consistent with another vehicle striking it from behind. This wasn't an accident. It was a staged disappearance. Still, the confession sparks something unexpected. Others begin to talk. Old deputies call in anonymously, offering fragments of memory. One recalls a second cruiser leaving the county lot without being logged that night. Another says he heard the sound of two engines in the distance, near the river bend, just before the storm rolled in. The story starts to take shape. Linda met Rick near the forest boundary, maybe to exchange information. She realized someone else had followed. A chase, a confrontation, then silence. Investigators begin to see the timeline in color now. The rain falling hard that night, turning the back roads to mud. The sound of rushing water beneath the bridge. The glow of headlights flickering through trees. Linda's last radio call, 10 to 20, checking the crossing, wasn't routine. It was a warning. She'd seen something, maybe another cruiser waiting in the dark. When they return to the bend months later to finish the reconstruction, the state investigators stand in the same spot where the old trail gives way to the slope. The earth is soft, the same way it must have been that night after the flood. They imagine the weight of a patrol car, the force it would take to send it over. Then they look at the spot where the other tire tracks were found, the second vehicle. It's all there, frozen in mud and memory. For the first time, they can picture the final moments. The confrontation, the desperate push, the river swallowing everything before dawn. Linda wasn't lost in the flood. She was erased by it. Yet even with all the evidence, the truth remains tangled. The retired deputy who confessed is too old to stand trial. Key records were destroyed years ago in a warehouse fire. The state closes its inquiry, citing insufficient evidence for prosecution. But for those who've carried the weight of Linda Carver's disappearance, the story doesn't end there. The new sheriff, who grew up in the same town Linda once patrolled, visits her memorial stone beside the courthouse. He lays a single rose, his badge glinting in the sun. "She was one of ours," he says softly. "She didn't deserve this." The wind moves through the trees nearby, the same forest that once kept it secret for nearly 2 decades. Beneath the soil and the shifting riverbed, time has buried much, but not everything. The clues remain faint and stubborn, waiting for someone else to ask the question that still haunts Clearwater County. If Linda's death was an accident, then who pushed her car? And somewhere out there, maybe along the old service trail overgrown with moss and silence, that answer still lingers, just beyond reach, but never gone. For nearly 2 decades, the story of Deputy Linda Carver had drifted through Clearwater County like fog, half memory, half myth. But in early 2003, A final round of forensic testing pulled the truth from the silt where it had been hiding all along. The recovered patrol car, what was left of it, was shipped to a state lab, where investigators began the slow, meticulous process of reconstructing the interior. Every rusted screw, every strand of decayed fabric, every piece of corroded metal was cataloged and examined. It was supposed to be confirmation of what they already knew, that a tragic accident had taken her life during the flood of '84. Instead, what they found shattered that narrative completely. Deep inside the driver's side frame, beneath layers of rust and river grit, a bullet fragment was lodged into the seat steel support bar. At first, the technicians assumed it was debris from the river, a fragment of metal carried by the current. But when the forensic metallurgist examined it under magnification, the striations told another story. It was a 9mm slug, fired at close range. The bullet had entered from behind the driver's seat and flattened on impact, never exiting. It had been there the entire time, preserved by the cold, silty water. The implications hit hard. Linda hadn't drowned. She'd been shot. From there, the evidence began to fall into place like long-buried bones rising through the earth. The steering column showed signs of forced locking, its mechanism jammed with a wedge of metal. The gear shift was fixed in neutral. The emergency brake, something every patrol officer habitually set before stepping out of their car, had been released. Whoever staged the crash wanted the car to roll freely, down the incline and into the river. It wasn't an accident, not even close. It was an execution disguised as one. When investigators brought these findings to the surviving former deputy, the same man who'd claimed Linda's death was an accident gone wrong, his story began to unravel. At first, he repeated what he'd said before, that there'd been confusion, a scuffle, a mistake. But the sight of the bullet fragment changed everything. His hands began to shake. He asked for water. And after a long silence, he finally said what no one had ever admitted out loud. I wasn't alone that night. He named two men, both ex-law enforcement, both part of a private security arrangement tied to the regional logging company that bordered the meth distribution routes. One had died years earlier in a car accident. The other, long retired, was still alive, living quietly in another county. According to the confession, Linda had discovered that the so-called security outfit was a front, a handful of former deputies providing safe passage for trucks that carried more than lumber through those backroads. She'd confronted one of them after realizing their patrol maps had been altered, routes changed without explanation. That night, she went to meet her informant, intending to collect proof. But someone was waiting. The truth, as it emerged, was devastatingly simple. Linda's last radio call wasn't a sign-off, it was a signal. 10 to 20, checking the crossing, she'd said, voice steady. Investigators now believed she knew something was wrong, that she was being followed. Moments later, she was ambushed on the service trail, above the river bend. A shot fired through the seat. Her car rolled, neutral gear, brake released, down the incline and into the flood-swollen river. The current did the rest. By the time the storm cleared, every trace of her and her car had been swept beneath silt and timber. When the county prosecutor received the full forensic report, he ordered a formal review of the case. For the first time in nearly 20 years, Linda Carver's name was spoken in the courtroom again. The findings were read aloud before a packed gallery, her surviving relatives in the front row, old deputies behind them, some in uniform, some long retired. The state pathologist described how the bullet fragment matched the caliber issued to local law enforcement in the early '80s. The courtroom went still. The sheriff's department released a statement the next day. Deputy Linda Carver was killed in the line of duty. Her death had been ruled a homicide. For the people of Clearwater County, it was closure, but not peace. The town had spent years whispering her name, weaving theories, blaming the river, the storm, fate. Now they knew it was none of those things. It was betrayal, one of their own silence for trying to do the right thing. The retired deputy who confessed was charged with obstruction and conspiracy, but was too frail to stand trial. The second accomplice, when confronted, denied involvement until his death months later. No one ever fully paid for what happened that night. But for Linda's family, the truth itself was a kind of justice. In the summer of 2004, nearly 20 years to the day she vanished, the county held a memorial at the rebuilt Dry Fork Bridge. The old logging trail had been paved over by then, the River Commer, its banks reinforced with stone. A bronze plaque was mounted at the bridge's edge, bearing her name, Deputy Linda Carver, End of watch, June 14th, 1984. The entire department turned out, standing in crisp uniforms under a gray morning sky. The sheriff read a short statement before laying a folded flag in the hands of Linda's younger brother. He'd been just a teenager when she disappeared. Now his hair was graying, his eyes fixed on the water below. She was the kind of officer who believed the truth mattered, the sheriff said quietly. And now the truth belongs to her. Locals gathered along the bank, some carrying flowers, others standing silently with their hats pressed to their chests. Among them were loggers who'd worked those woods for decades, people who once believed the story had ended with a flood. Many wept openly as the honor guard raised their rifles in salute. The sound echoed off the trees and faded into the hills. 3 shots, then silence. After the ceremony, the crowd lingered by the railing, watching the river slip beneath the bridge. The same river that had swallowed a secret for nearly 2 decades now carried her name in its reflection. The water moved gently, smooth and endless, the current whispering over the rocks below. Somewhere down there, they knew, pieces of the old patrol car still lay buried under layers of mud and time. For the county, the case became a symbol, a reminder of how truth can sink deep but never disappear completely. Every few years, when the floods return and the river rises, people say you can still see the shimmer of metal near the bend. Whether it's debris or something else, no one really knows. But they all remember the story. How a deputy vanished on a rainy night. How a handcuff buried in silt reopened a case. How the river gave back what it had taken. Even now, long after the headlines have faded and the files have been archived, the people of Clearwater still slow down when crossing Dry Fork Bridge. Some say it's habit. Others say it's respect. But a few, the ones who were there that day, admit quietly that sometimes, especially when the wind moves just right, they can hear something beneath the water. A faint whisper, almost like a voice carried by the current. No one knows if it's real or just imagination. But everyone agrees on one thing: the river remembers. And it always will.